We continue to read in the letter to the Romans, Paul's letters to the Romans. We're going to read a bit more than what is printed in your bulletin because Paul's argument here is a little bit complicated. So we need the whole context. So we're going to start in the first verse of the chapter and read for a little bit. And so I invite you to follow along. So I ask you, has God rejected his people? Absolutely not. I am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God hasn't rejected his people who he knew in advance. Or don't you know what the scripture says in the case of Elijah when he pleads with God against Israel? Elijah says, "Lord, they have killed your prophets and they have torn down your altars. I am the only one left and they are trying to take my life." But God replied, "I have kept for myself 7,000 people who have not bowed their knees to Baal." So also in the present time, there is a remaining group by the choice of God's grace. But if it is by grace, it isn't by what's done anymore. If it were, God's grace wouldn't be grace. So what? Israel didn't find what it was looking for. Those who were chosen found it, but the others were resistant. As is written, God gave them a dull spirit, so that their eyes would not see and their ears not hear right up until the present day. And David says, "Their table should become a pitfall and a trap, a stumbling block and a payback to them for what they have done. Their eyes should be darkened so they can't see and their backs always bent." So I'm asking you, they haven't stumbled so that they've fallen permanently, have they? Absolutely not. But salvation has come to the Gentiles by their failure in order to make Israel jealous. But if their failure brings riches to the world and their defeat brings riches to the Gentiles, how much more will come from the completion of their number? I am speaking to the Gentiles because I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I published my own ministry in the hopes that somehow I might make my own people jealous and save them. If their rejection has brought about a close relationship between God and the world, how can their acceptance mean anything less than life from the dead? If part of a batch of dough is offered to God as holy, the whole batch of dough is holy. If a root is holy, the branches will be holy. If some of the branches are broken off, and you were a wild olive branch, and you were grafted in among the other branches and shared the root that produces the oil of the olive tree, then don't brag like you're better than the other branches. If you do brag, be careful. You are not what sustains the root. It is the root that sustains you. Will you say then that branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in? Fine. They were broken off because they weren't faithful, but you stand only by your faithfulness. So don't think in a proud way. Instead, be afraid. Because if God doesn't spare the natural branches, he won't spare you either. So look at God's kindness and harshness. There is harshness for those who fail, but it is God's kindness for you, provided you continue in that kindness. And even those who were cut off will be grafted back in if they don't continue to be unfaithful, because God is able to graft them in again. If you were naturally part of a wild olive tree and you were cut off, and then contrary to nature, you are grafted into the cultivated olive tree, won't these natural branches stand an even better chance of being grafted in? I don't want you to be unaware. I don't want you to think too highly of yourselves. A part of Israel has become resistant until the full number comes in. And this way all Israel will be saved, as it is written, "The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodly behavior from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." According to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But according to God's choice, they are loved for the sake of their ancestors. God's gifts and calling can't be taken back. Once you were disobedient to God, but now you have mercy because they were disobedient. In the same way, they have also been disobedient because of the mercy that you received, so they can now receive mercy. God has locked up all people in sin in order to have mercy. God's riches, wisdom, and knowledge are deep. They are mysterious, and they are hard to track. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is a lot. It's a lot. Paul's arguments are really dense because Paul is writing, you have to remember, letters. These are letters that were sent as a whole to be written and read by people in various stops around. So what Paul would do was he would write the letter and he would give it to somebody like Joe, and then Joe would go and read it to churches all around town, all around the country, because there was no TV or anything like that. So Paul couldn't physically share all of this stuff. So Paul is trying to explain really, really complicated things in a written format. And we always lose nuance in writing. How many of us haven't sent a text message that somebody else got upset about? And we were like, oh, I didn't mean that. That's not at all what I meant. But that was read that other way? Because you can't, use tone in text messages. So Paul's letters are hard for us if we don't take the time to take them apart and to ask the question underneath, which is, what is the problem that Paul is trying to address? What is the problem that Paul is trying to address? We know that Paul can't read or write because Paul has some sort of eyesight issue. He can't read or write, and so he's dictating, he's literally speaking these letters out loud to Timothy as Timothy writes them down. And so every single one is to address a specific problem in a specific church. The problem with the church in Rome was that they were small but mighty. They were a group of converted Jews, people who had grown up in the synagogue but who had found the grace offered by God, and so were converting to Christianity. But they were also newfound converts. People who had never heard of the faith of Abraham. They didn't know who Abraham was. They had no idea about all the history that came with it. They were new believers. They were brand new to the faith and had absolutely no idea what was going on. But they found God's grace. And it was enough for them. It was enough for them to come and to be a part of the community. And so the church in Rome struggles with what to do about these two different groups. It struggles because there's the one group that has all of that history, all of their Jewish faith and tradition, all of the things that they have been brought up to do in the synagogue. They have all of these rules and expectations that have been brought with them. And the new people, the Gentiles, are coming into this new place and asking questions. Why, if by the grace of God we're saved, do we have to offer sacrifice? Why, if by the grace of God we are claimed as Christians, do you think you're better than us because you have all this history and tradition as a Jew? Why does God give grace to some and not to others if we are saved by what we do? And there was no good answer. There was no good answer. They struggled with this question. Why are some saved and others not? Why do some show outward signs of faith and others don't? Why is it that it appears that God likes some people better than others? And if we're honest with ourselves, we've had all of these same questions in our lives. It's one of the biggest tripping points that young people often have as they grow up, which is, why is it my faith better than others? It's a question we all struggle with, and there are no good answers. Because the truth is, we don't understand. We don't know what God knows. We don't have God's vision for the world. We stumble through these questions, and we give the best answers that we can, and we argue, and we discover things over time, and often our answer to these questions change. But they're never totally satisfactory. There's always a little bit of a question in our hearts. Now here, Paul is specifically addressing the idea of some people who have faith and then fall away. Some people who have faith, it seems, who are living a good Christian life, who are part of the tree and then all of a sudden fall away. And nobody is real clear why. Did God remove grace from them? Is God punishing them in some way? Is there some sort of break that happens here? What is the cause of this action? And Paul says, relax. Paul says, relax. What he says here is that some of the branches of a tree fall off, but that God can always graft them back together, that God can always bring those things back into the tree because it is God's tree. God says, Paul says, that anything can be brought into the tree of God, that any branch can be brought into the tree of God, whether it is old or new, whether it is young or old, whether it does all the right things, or whether it's just sparking faith, that all of those branches are grafted by God into the tree. And so we need to stop thinking we know. We need to stop thinking that we have the only answers. We need to stop thinking we hold the only truth. We need to stop thinking that we know who is in and who is out, because only God knows those things. Paul reminds us to be humble. See, the problem is that way back in the garden, when Adam and Eve made some choices that were not amazing, two things happened to us that God never intended. When God created humanity, it was to have relationship with somebody. If you've ever been stuck in a house by yourself for long periods of time, you know how exciting it is just to have a human being to talk to, right? My sister went to visit my dad the other day because he's watching her girls this week. And she went to visit him, and she showed up at 9 a.m. that morning to drop him off, and he wouldn't let her leave. He wouldn't let her leave, poor guy, because he didn't have anybody to talk to for a while. And like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she calls me, and she's like, hey, can you talk to Dad for a little while so I can leave? Who we love. I mean, we love our father. But he's been stuck in a house by himself for a week, and he just wanted a human being to talk to, right? We see this happening with young people from time to time now, where they're finding these AI bots that they can have relationships with. I don't know if you've seen this. They can go online and have whole conversations with these AI bots who are taught to respond to them like a human being. And because they are lonely and scared and afraid, they start to have what feels like actual relationships with these AI bots. And that should terrify you. And Paul is saying that all of us are locked into this temptation. All of us are locked into the temptation of certainty, of answers, of, in our weakest moments, finding the things that make us feel good, even if we know in our brains that it's not good for us. Because we can sit and judge these teenagers for going online and talking to these computers, but how many of us have not wanted to have the same kind of thing? How many of us in our loneliness have not found things that make us feel better, even if it's just for the moment in time? We have a crisis among young men in our country, and they're finding these answers on podcasts, which lead them down roads that are toxic. We have a crisis in our country among elderly people who sit in their house all day with no one to talk to. We have a crisis in our country of loneliness. And that temptation, that need, that core part of who we are, was part of us from the beginning of time. That need for relationship with one another, that need to be validated, that need to feel whole and complete and a part of something valuable has been part of us since the garden. And ever since the garden, we've had the snake in our ear tempting us to find answers in unsatisfying places, tempting us into certainty, tempting us into the idea that if we just have the knowledge of good and evil, if we just have the knowledge of why things happen, that we would be satisfied. If we just knew enough, if we were just God enough, if we took the place of God, in fact, in our lives and in the world, then everything would be fine, and that need that we find within ourselves will be full. Grace offers us something different. God's grace offers us the ability to live in our vulnerability, to not fill that space up, to not put things into ourselves that are toxic and harmful and respond to our sin and make our sin feel good and let it speak louder and louder, because grace offers us the ability to live with that vulnerability, to live in the acknowledgement that we do not know everything and never will, that we don't have the right answers for everything, that often we don't have the right answers for almost anything, that we don't know who is in and who is out, that we don't know what is happening in other people's lives. It gives us the grace of curiosity, of questions. It allows us to sit with ourselves in a comfortable way that allows us to explore what God is stirring up inside of us. Sin wants us to run away from that. Sin wants us to live in certainty, to reach back on tools and skills that we have, that we can solve all these problems ourselves. That if we just do things in a slightly different way, if we just add the numbers up differently in our Excel columns, if we put different clothes on and wear different kinds of makeup and do different things to our hair, then everybody will know how awesome we are, and maybe we'll actually feel good about ourselves. But God's grace tells us that we are none of those things, that we are more than that. We are more than what our sin tells us about ourselves. We are God's. We are God's, and we can live into the confidence that trusting in God's future for us will bring. Paul reminds us that God never steps out on God's promises, that God brings to fulfillment everything that God promised us, and God will always bring you into fulfillment if we can trust God's words more than the ones inside of us. If we can trust the truth of God's grace more than the words inside of us which lie and tell us we are not good enough, that we are not enough, and that if we don't have control over everything, life will spin out of control. Grace is God's gift to you. To be vulnerable, to be honest, and to ignore the lies that come from within yourself. And I offer that gift to you. Amen.